Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. So, in just a moment. So, go ahead and grab a seat. If you're in the right room, that is. Okay. Ooh, that's pretty loud. All right, thanks for coming. I know it's a pretty long day, pretty early start, and this is the last session in the ping track today. So thanks for your time. Thanks for being here, and hopefully the event's been great so far for you guys. All right, so I'm going to talk about identity-defined security, and I'm going to switch it up a little bit, do a few demo snippets throughout. Some of you may have seen some of them. Others, probably it's new information. So let's get started. So how many of you have seen this quote? Show of hands. Anybody? Okay. If it looks at all familiar, maybe you read the 2017 Verizon DBIR, right? Data Breach Investigations Report. If you haven't, I recommend you pick it up and read it. It's actually extremely informative as well as entertaining. It's very, very well written. But Verizon does a great job with that. But this is the quote they have at the very beginning of the data breach report. And it's kind of an interesting quote, okay? And the reason I went ahead and put it in here is because at the end of the day, if you look at the data on breaches, it can be pretty depressing. But we're all here as evidence that there is hope because you're sitting here, because you're at this conference, because there's companies like Ping and others trying to solve this, right? There is hope. And so that's what this is about, is how do we solve some of the basic challenges around security and compliance. So there's three particular challenges I'm going to look at today. The first is that of authentication. Start with the most sort of basic challenge. Say basic challenge. It's not necessarily the most basic to solve, but I'm going to talk about one basic component of a solution. And then we're going to move on to access control. So now that we have an authenticated user, what should they have authorization to, right? What should they have access to? And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can solve some of the challenges there with adaptive access control. And then finally, we're going to look at a couple of the new regulations that are coming down. Patrick mentioned PSD2 and GDPR. We're going to talk a little bit about those and how Ping can help solve those challenges as well. So this is a pretty depressing stat. That's why that hope quote was there. Because 81% of breaches, according to the DBIR in 2017, leverage weak or stolen credentials. Okay? So as much as this group is trying to get the word out that passwords are not secure, evidently the word isn't quite gotten out, or we haven't quite implemented the solution. And so, predictably, part of the solution is multi-factor authentication. So many of you know Ping ID, or know that Ping has a solution called Ping ID. We bought a company in Israel a few years ago, and so it's come a long ways. So one of the cool things that we've implemented in Ping ID is advanced policy support in the last year or so, and I'm going to show a simple demo of that. One of the things we've seen customers perfect on our behalf is how to roll out Ping ID to very large numbers of users effectively. And in fact, Shane Harms from Cisco is going to come up and talk about their story at the end. And so that's going to be a really, really good case study on how multi-factor authentication can be successfully rolled out. And then there's some other features. If you don't want to use Ping ID for all of your users, or you want to implement it differently for privileged users, for instance, there's some interesting features on that for protecting privileged users. And then flexible authentication methods. So one of the cool things is everybody sort of that knows Ping ID maybe has seen this swipe. I mean, I think back, who all was at CIS in Monterey? Anybody? Nobody. Okay. Well, we were all wearing these shirts with this big red button. It said swipe swipe and then it equals work, basically, was the idea. And everybody, anyway, it was, so that's when we actually first rolled out Ping ID. It was this notion that you can get a push notification to your phone, do multi-effect authentication instead of having to put in a 6-digit code with a swipe, okay? Bottom line is there's a lot more to Ping ID than that. We can do one-time passcodes via email, via SMS. We can do integration to Yubico. We can do voice-based authentication. There's a lot of features. There's a desktop application, which is really cool for Mac and Windows. And so there's a lot of different options on how you do that second factor authentication. So at this point, let me just do a quick demo. All right, so I recorded these just to make it a little simpler. So in this demo, I'm just going to set it up. I'm going to authenticate twice. The first time I'm going to authenticate, I'm inside a geofence. I'm inside one of the Ping offices. In this case, I actually recorded this in San Francisco, so it's at the San Francisco office. And so that first time I authenticate, again, I'm inside a geofence. I'm going to show you how that policy gets set up. And the second time I authenticate, I'm outside the geofence. And you're going to see what's different about that authentication experience for the user. So here we are in the Ping ID policies. First thing I'll show you is that there's this from company network policy. And within there, you can implement these geofences for each of your offices or whatever locations you choose. And you can specify where that location is, how big the geofence is, and so forth, and what the action should be. So in this case, I also am just bringing up my mobile device to show you that I'm actually in that same location. You can see the dots correspond. The Adolf Gasser Photography, I don't know why that's the label, but that's where our office is. But I'm exactly the same location on my phone using Google Maps. And so now I'm going to go ahead and save this. First, I'm actually going to move it to the top. So that's the first policy that gets executed. And then I'm going to save it. And then I'm going to authenticate. And so now I put in my password, and I click Sign On. And because I'm inside the geofence, and the policy states I should be approved, as I authenticate, it should simply do nothing on my phone, and I should be authenticated and just let in, okay? So that's authentication number one. The second authentication, I've now moved. I've gone down the street, 4 blocks. In fact, you can see I did a walking path back to the office. You can see I'm 4 minutes away. And I'm going to go ahead and put in my password again. Excuse me. To authenticate again. And this time, that policy should say I'm not in the geofence. It should go to the next policy. The next policy is if I'm in the US, should require a fingerprint. Touch ID in this case. And so indeed, you can see on my phone, it required Touch ID, and now I'm authenticated. So kind of a cool way in which you can do some interesting advanced capabilities with Ping ID. All right, back to the presentation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about access. So access is important. And identity, specifically access management, is important. In fact, there's a ton of studies and tons of data out there, but 90% of those surveyed last year in a digital transformation survey and said that IAM, or identity access management, generically, of course, is important to access for mobile, right? A very high percentage said it's important for cloud. But there's other studies which state that people are actually delaying their move to the cloud, delaying move to mobile because of security concerns. And so when you correlate these two, there's a correlation. How we do identity and access management either helps or hurts, potentially, our ability to roll out successfully new technologies in our digital transformation. And so access security is one of those. In fact, what we see is a lot of companies, there was a whole session just before this about how part of it was about WAM systems, not all of it, but about modernization, right? And this is a big area. So what we see a lot of times is organizations have baked authorization into their applications, or they're using outdated proprietary instead of standards, or technology instead of standards. And so Ping Access is a modern access management system, allows for adaptive authentication. You can centralize policies. You can control access at not just the application level, but the individual page level. You can enforce policies using both proxy or agent architectures. And you can unify sessions across both web and API because it protects both through that proxy. We can protect both APIs as well as web applications. So with the same set of policies. And then also get to unify those sessions. So there's some really interesting features within Ping Access. And I'm just going to show you a quick demo of how Ping Access, one use case for Ping Access. First I got to get to the right demo. That's not the right one. Here we go. So in this one, Susan Lee is going to authenticate. Whoop, you can't see that. That's a problem. Hold on. So, all right. So here we go. So in this case, Susan Lee is going to go ahead and authenticate. And Susan Lee is part of the sales group at Lux Confections. And so you can see that there. We've captured some of the attributes. She's in the group sales. And in this case, of course, we were also doing OAuth. But what's interesting is there's this secret product launch page. And sales does not have access. Sales should not have access to a secret product launch page. But I'm going to start a new browser up, and I'm going to sign in the second time and authenticate with Will Barley. Will Barley, as you'll see in a moment, is part of the product management group and should have access to that page, theoretically. And so at this point, Will's going to click on that page link. And when Will clicks on it, what you're going to see is that policy, sure enough, something's different here, but the policy doesn't only state that he has access immediately, it's actually a step-up authentication that's going to require him, through Ping ID, to use Yubico. And so over here, he put his YubiKey device into his USB port, tapped that, and he was authenticated. So what's cool about this is authentication, none of that logic was baked into the application, okay? Ping Access was sitting in front of that application. And URL by URL was determining policy. On the first time through, Susan Lee, it evaluated, the policy stated evaluate the group that this user is in and either allow access or not, right? She was denied access because she was in the wrong group. The second time around, right, we looked at the policy again, said, hey, what group is this person in? But then said, oh, now it requires step-up authentication, and for product management, it required, in this case, Ping ID with YubiKey. So, just an example of pulling authenticate or authorization and access policy out of the application. Okay, so moving along. So a couple of new compliance standards. There's a third challenge area, is compliance. So PSD2 and GDPR both come into effect in 2018. PSD2 in January, and GDPR later on. Both of those are EU regulations or directives, okay? However, PSD2 is specifically for companies in Europe, specifically financial institutions. How many of you are a European financial institution? Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because nobody is going to be impacted by that directly yet, okay? But many of these are coming, many of these concepts and types of regulations are coming to the US as well, right? So there's new regulations coming in both financial, there's some new regulations around data privacy. It's questionable about when those will come into place exactly, but they are coming. And GDPR, however, is how many of you have customers that you either market to or sell to in Europe? Okay, so several of you. And so you'll be impacted by GDPR. So let's talk about these for a minute. So PSD2. This is an interesting one. So basically it states that bank or financial institutions across Europe must open up their APIs or access to their APIs to third parties. They have to publish those APIs, and any functionality or any function or feature they have in an online banking system has to be accessible via an API to a third party. Okay? That's what's stated. But PSD2 falls short of specifying how. Okay? But some of the key requirements are access to that account information via the APIs, consent, right? They have to actually collect and manage consent from the end user, and strong customer authentication. So those are three of the key technical requirements. But the UK said, okay, that's a good start, but we need to be more specific about what those common APIs should be and how they're secured. And so the UK, their open banking initiative goes beyond that to specify that OAuth 2 must be used, OpenID Connect, and more specifically, the OpenID Foundation's financial API, or FAPI, specifications will also be part of what's required, okay? So the financial institutions in the US are taking note, because even if this isn't implemented as a standard or a regulation, it may be some best practices that can be garnered from this for anybody that has high risk, high value transactions or APIs that they want to secure. So a lot of good stuff could come out of this. How does it work? So the basic flow is pretty simple. Most of you are probably, or many of you may be familiar with OAuth. This is very similar to just an OAuth flow, but basically, customer, called a PSU or payment services user, initiates a transaction to a third party. The third party could be somebody who's they're buying something from, right, for a payment, or it could be somebody who's aggregating information like Mint, a Mint type organization. That third party then makes a request of the bank. The bank at this point says, hey, I need to make sure that my customer has granted you access. So the first thing that has to happen is we have to authenticate the user through a strong customer authentication, which is basically multi-factor authentication, a form of multi-factor or two-factor authentication. Once the customer is authenticated, we must gain consent. Now this has to be auditable consent. I have to write a record into place that this person consented to this data and this use case for this time frame by this third party, right? It has to be written, auditable record of consent, and the bank is required to keep those auditable records of consent, okay? At that point, okay, the bank can then give back an authorization code. So instead of just giving a token back, again, one of the recommendations is a code flow, right? So they're going to get a code, but now that third party can use the code to exchange for a token via an API, a REST API call, which makes that a much more secure form of OAuth flow. And then they can then use that token, of course, to make a call to the API. So this is just part of what, for instance, FAPI specifies as the flow that's required by a PSD2 type transaction. But it is, there's some really good best practices in this for other API security. All right, and we have a solution for this. I'm not going to go into the detail at all. We have a solution. All of our products, in essence, come into play here. But you can find out more here on our landing page at pingidentity.com/PSD2. There's a white paper that explains a lot more detail. And if you know Pam Dingle, she helped significantly write that. All right, so then the next standard is GDPR. So GDPR, there's a few things that are interesting. Number one, it really has global scope because anybody who touches a European citizen could be affected. There's a broad definition for personal data. Personal data isn't just name and address and credit card. It's actually browsing history, browsing patterns. So if you even process like Google Analytics type information for European citizens, you need to be compliant with this, meaning you have to gain consent to collect that information from that European citizen, and you have to maintain a record of that consent, similar to what I talked about for PSD2. And there are very, very, very heavy fines for non-compliance. So if you don't already have a plan in place around GDPR, you should. If you touch EU citizens in any way, shape, or form, or their data. So some of the key requirements are around consent, around data access and rectification, erasure, or right to be forgotten, data portability, data protection, and data security. The good news is that a comprehensive customer identity and access management solution helps. There's no such thing as a turnkey solution for GDPR. So one of the things I say is if GDPR is this big, okay, customer identity and access management or identity access management is this big, okay, this big of the solution. And then what Ping can help you with is even smaller than that, depending upon your use case and depending upon what's going on. But at the end of the day, right, there is an important role for how you manage consumer data, right? How you give your users access to manage their preferences and privacy and so forth, how you manage consent, how you share the data with third parties via policy, how do you secure the data? Is it secure by design? Is it is all your customer data in an encrypted form in all instances, or in a form that the user cannot be identified in all instances within all of your repositories? Who has access? Do you have policy governing access to all of those locations and so forth? So there's a lot to this, and identity access management does play a pretty significant role, but again, it's not the end-all be-all, right? So I'm going to show just a really short demo, and then I'm going to get Shane up here to talk about Cisco's MFA journey. Okay, so in this demo, this is not ideal, but it gives you some idea of Ping's capabilities around consent. And this is not tuned to GDPR specifically, but I'll talk you through it. So the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to implement a policy for sharing from a retail organization called Shopco to a delivery co, to a third party. So this is actually an admin that implemented a policy, okay? By checking those boxes and so forth, they implemented actually a policy, a data access policy. Now the policy then allows delivery co, access to customer data. In fact, these are the fields that were specified, okay? And so those are the fields that, at this point, delivery co has access to. But Ashley, one of the retail customers of Shopco, is going to come along and is going to manage her profile. And again, this is specified by GDPR that you have the ability to inspect your data and then manage that profile and preferences. And so she's unchecked email. She doesn't want delivery co to have access to her email. So when we go back and refresh this data, again, delivery co goes back and refreshes their data, suddenly they have no access to that email address because there's two policies in place, in essence, right? There's the policy from the corporate perspective, and then there's the individual or the personal preference policy. Both come into play, are protecting the data at the data source to basically implement this. So again, this isn't logic per se built into an application. How you actually gain the consent, how you manage that consent, yes, of course, that's in the application. You build that, make it easy for your customer. But in terms of the actual policy being written, it's written into Ping data governance, and that's governing access to the Ping directory. The Ping directory can store, interestingly enough, not only customer profile information, but also credential information, but also consent objects. And so there's actually another session where Remy from Ping is going to go into a bunch of consent flows that are really interesting about how you might think about architecting consent using a product like Ping Directory. So with that, let me bring up Shane. All right, here you go.
Thank you. Matt was gracious enough to give me 5 minutes to recap the last 6 months of my life. So I'll start about 6 months ago. My team and I went to Cloud Identify in San Francisco, and I see Greg sitting here in the front row, so I just have to say this. Greg told us how easy it was to roll MFA out across the entire enterprise, right? Yes, and I believed you naively. So here's the journey we took, and it started actually a little bit before Identify, but we were very curious to hear the lessons learned that you shared with us there. Last October, we started this rollout, and our CISO at the time said, you got 12 months to figure out how to get MFA across your entire company. That was 140,000 users, 3,000 applications. This was not selected applications, it was do it everywhere. So we recognized early that the challenge here was not technical, right? It wasn't with the product. The challenge is with your users. How do you get 140,000 people to stop using username password, to get used to a normal that's not normal for them? So we broke this out in two ways, and there was, I think there's one big lesson learned out of the user readiness piece that I'll share. We started this by figuring out how do we communicate this. We went to our CIO, we crafted an email, and we said, here's why we're doing this, right? We're trying to position ourselves as a security company. We see these massive breaches that are happening. That happens at Cisco, we're in trouble as a company. So we crafted a message that had this piece in it. We sent this out to his entire organization, about 40,000 people, said you've got 30 days, you have to sign up for Ping ID, get ready to use it. We sent that out 3 times, 5% of the people. 5% signed up. We're like, okay, wait a minute. We got to step back and figure out how to do this differently. And the lesson learned is you've got to figure out how to insert yourself into the user's workflow and force this. Now there was 2 things that we did here. What you see on the top left, so what we do is make users every 6 months reset their password. We actually embedded ourselves into that password reset process, so when they were forced to reset their password, we didn't allow them to do it until they actually signed up for Ping ID. So that was step 1. So we did that in February. Within 6 months, every person at Cisco will have to sign up. We pre-staged this prior to actually turning on any of the applications. But the second piece that we did, after we did that, we started getting a lot of users saying, I've signed up. I don't know where to use this at yet, because we hadn't turned the applications on. So the second piece we did was what we call mandatory MFA, where we replaced the login page. Every single application is now protected by what you're seeing on the top right, which is, it's a couple pieces. It's informational. We're moving to MFA, and I know that's tiny, you can't see it, but I'll talk through it. We're moving to MFA. Here's information on that, why we're doing it, and here's how to get ready. And also, if you've already signed up, click here and you can start using it and see what the experience is like. So that's been deployed everywhere since February. So from that February timeframe when we started that to now, we've got about 90,000 users that are signed up. We have about a little over 30,000 still to go. Now the second part of this then is the actual enablement. So it's interesting. I've talked to a lot of people that have done MFA, and they've done it in different ways. I'll say what we're doing at Cisco is password. To me, the risk is password. I don't want people entering passwords, but I can't completely get away from them yet. So what we're doing is passwords once every 30 days. When you enter your username password, you get a token that's persistent, lasts for 30 days. And then the daily experience, the experience you have every time you have to single sign on, is just swipe. So as we go to mandatory, and we started this journey a couple months ago, we have not a lot, 300 applications about out of the 3,000, but we do plan on finishing this over the next 4 or 5 months. The experience is you no longer see a login page whatsoever. Your phone buzzes, you swipe, you're in. So those are a couple of the key lessons in the journey we're taking. I have no more time, I don't think. I will, I do have time. So the other thing I'll say, even though we did send out the email, and I want to be prescriptive here. I think the messaging is critical. I don't think there's anything I can do from a messaging perspective that's effective in getting people to adopt it, but it's still critical to educate the users what's happening to minimize how much noise you get. I think it's unfortunate that a lot of what we deal with is the 1 or 2% that are so overly vocal and criticize everything, and you spend so much time dealing with that. But there is the 90+% that when you reach out and actually get the feedback, they're actually loving the experience. So I could not in a slide possibly share all the things we've done from a communication perspective. Here's some of the big ones. I think the other big thing that you have to do going into this is you have to understand who your advocates are going to be. So we spent a lot of time talking about who are the key advocates at Cisco that we needed to help drive and deliver this messaging. The key mediums there was different messaging forums that we used to drive this, and then the last one was audiences, right? And you have to treat employees different from contractors, different from customers if you're doing that. The other thing I called out there was theater. It's really interesting. In EMEA, they're much more conscious around some of the privacy pieces. We led with a user experience story that worked in some theaters. In EMEA, they're like, don't tell me about user experience. I don't care and I don't like the user experience, but tell me security, I can buy into that. So you kind of have to understand your audiences there. Contingent workforce, we were very directive to them. Employees, we were very forceful with the mobile experience swipe, because I'm a huge advocate. I think the swipe is the greatest experience. So just a few lessons learned. Is there any questions? I hope in the next few months we're going to exceed Greg's rollout at Johnson & Johnson. Already passed you. Are we the largest customer now?
Probably are for Ping ID. I mean, one single customer that actually has implemented users. Do you know of any users bigger than 90,000? All right, thanks everybody for attending. We have another session coming on in here. So if you have any questions about anything I talked about, of course, you can come to our booth, or you can catch me somewhere else in the hallway. But thanks a lot.